Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support and the content we've been putting out. We have done a bunch of live streams, so you can check those out. The video on demand is definitely up there on our channel. Thank you to all the supporters who came through and showed us support as they normally do. We have a couple eliminations to discuss and one series opener to talk about as well today. And we have a live stream later today on Monday and another one on Tuesday to cover second round openers. Before we get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
So we had some big games over the weekend. We're recording on Sunday. You'll see it Monday. This is Sunday, several hours after the Cavs Magic game. But we'll get into the first elimination one over the weekend, and that was the Mavs eliminating the Clippers in game 6, 114-101. Win the series 4-2. Um, you know, those games on that specific day, I think pretty much kind of went how we expected, right? Like we expected Orlando to win game 6 in Orlando. In a relatively tight-ish game, right, at home. And then we expected the Clippers to probably win and beat out, or no, we expected the Mavs to beat out the Clippers in a game that was a little bit more competitive than the previous one, although this one was really only competitive in the first half. It was actually a tie game at halftime, and it ended up being, I think the Mavs went up by as much as 24 in the second half, and it was pretty much kind of what you would have expected, right? Like, one of the biggest reasons why we picked the Mavs to win this series was because we were pretty unsure and not very optimistic about the health of Kawhi. To his credit, he did come back in games 2 and 3, but he wasn't himself. And honestly, it kind of hurt the team when he was there because it threw everybody off rhythm. Not blaming him, but it threw everybody off rhythm, and he just wasn't that active, right? You know what I mean? So it's kind of hard to give a lot of minutes to a guy out there who's not really giving you much. And in game 3, he played less, so you knew something was going on physically. And to the Clippers' credit, right, they did win a couple of games. The 2 games that they won, he didn't play. But then obviously they lost 2 others, without him as well. And you could kind of see like, why you needed him in order to win this series, right? Because you just Paul George and Harden, right? They're not consistent enough guys, on a regular basis to be able to win you a playoff series. Now, to be fair, the team is built around those guys supporting Kawhi. But you look around and Paul George was 6 for 18, right? Harden was 5 for 16. Um, and it's like just not good enough, right? You got a decent game out of Zubac. He started PJ Tucker, Ty Lue started PJ Tucker in this game. And I think that was kind of also an underlying problem where it's like not being able to have like a 4-5 type player that you got, because I think they were hoping Tucker would be that. And because he wasn't, right? He's 38 or whatever. You gave up a lot of those type of players, right, in the Harden trade. So not having that type of player, I think, hurts because it just pushes Kawhi and Paul George, I guess, to a lesser extent, into more support, dirty work type guys, right? We kind of talked about that with the Lakers, where you're just kind of forcing your stars to also do a lot of the other stuff that typically is handled by role players, right? And so that's kind of a tough part. They do have some other decent players on the team coming off the bench, right? But then it's like, they couldn't give you enough. Norman Powell was okay. But again, that's better to have when you have Kawhi out there also, as opposed to, having to rely on Westbrook and Powell to bail out your second unit. And Westbrook wasn't good in this game and also just wasn't good in this series. And then even a guy like an Amir Coffey, right? He started the first 5 games and then, or I guess he started the non-Kawhi games,
Mm-hmm.
and then didn't start in this game. And obviously he couldn't do much, but you don't expect that, right? He would probably be like a 10th guy, 11th guy, on a roster, not really playing a whole lot. But yeah, it kind of comes down to that. And then with the Mavs, right? You just look over at them. They just look a lot more lively, no pun intended, and energetic, right? Like guys are running up and down the floor, pushing the pace. Luka didn't really shoot well in this game. Didn't really shoot well in the series at all, right? He was 1 for 10 from 3, 9 of 26 from the field. But Kyrie, this is why you get a guy like that, to pair with Luka, right? Where it's like for those games where Luka isn't, an A+, you have another guy who can give you that type of production, especially in those second halves, right? And then,
Yeah.
the bigs, right? They stepped up. You got good performances from Gafford and Lively on both ends of the floor. Unfortunately, Maxi Kleba, who had actually started to play well in this series, he got hurt. They say he's supposed to be out at least 3 weeks, but he may not come back at all. That was a pretty bad fall where he messed up his shoulder. Um, but then it's kind of interesting, right? Because like Hardaway gets hurt, doesn't play at all in this series after I think the first game or so. But it opens up minutes for Josh Green, right? Who's not as good of an offensive player, but kind of an energy hustle guy, maybe a more helpful guy than Tim Hardaway, aside from the stretches where, you know, there's stretches where the offense gets a little bit stagnant because, maybe their guys aren't scoring as much. But it is interesting because it's like, I guess, we can obviously say, like, yeah, the Mavs, they should have won the series. We expected them to win when Kawhi didn't play. Um, but either way, you still give them a lot of credit, right? Because they had been bounced out of the first round the first couple of times they played this team. I think the first time, right, Porzingis got hurt about halfway through that series. Um, but either way, just the things that the Mavs have been able to do since the deadline, where now they can play defense at a pretty high level in addition to already having the offensive firepower, right? Like the role players on this team that surround Luca and Kyrie are better than the role players from last year, right? Which also helps out a lot, just having better players and energy guys around them. So, they look legit, right? They look really good. It'll be interesting to see what happens, come next round. And obviously, we'll get into that when we get there. But, for the Mavs, this is a good step forward, right? After, last year's pretty disastrous season, right? Where they start off where they lose Jalen Brunson to the Knicks, right? Start off okay, but you could tell that they probably weren't going to be able to do a lot because they didn't have much after Luca. And then they made the trade for Kyrie at the deadline where they got him for pretty little, right? Because obviously his stock had fallen, right? We talked about the live stream, how kind of stunning, like the turnaround from him, personally. But the fact that they were able to get him for the cheap and then it didn't work out because they weren't winning a lot of games. The defense was awful. Then they just missed the playoffs. They tanked to get that lottery pick. But since then, everything's worked out for them, right? Lively turned out pretty well. The moves they made in the offseason, right? Some of them, they had to turn into other stuff, right? Like they signed Grant Williams, which we like. Started off the season well, then didn't pan out, but they were able to flip him. And then you bring in guys like Gafford and PJ Washington, then Washington's a guy that can kind of help you out on both ends too, right? Because he can space the floor and shoot the three, and they use him a lot on defense to guard other, wings or guards or whatever, in a switching defense. So there's a lot to like, from the Mavs, and a lot of it even starts again with a guy like a Kyrie, right, who's kind of changed, his leadership style, from what it was before, where he's been doing a really good job, and again, like he signed the contract. You didn't know how it was going to go, but you do give a lot of credit to him because he's even on the defensive end, right, where he's not really known as a strong defender. He's competing defensively, right? He's made a lot of hustle plays, goes after loose balls, gets rebounds, even goes out and gets steals. He's a guy that's guarding Harden, Paul George at different points. So, pretty impressive series win, even though, Kawhi wasn't really himself. But again, that's kind of been the issue with the Clippers for the last several years, and we'll get into that, when we get there.
Yeah, and it's like I think this elimination kind of puts the whole Clippers team I think under a huge microscope, especially a bigger one than I think people had projected. Just being that they didn't have Kawhi, I think that's the biggest thing. And I think you really have to look at the Paul George trade, and I think context matters for sure because I think him eventually getting to LA was kind of at the request of Kawhi Leonard, so that you do have to take that into account. But at the end of the day, it looks like it's kind of a bad trade because, you look at Shea and he's been balling on another level, and all you got in return was Paul George. You gave up a lot to get this guy, and he hasn't really done too much for you, especially in the postseason. Like in the regular season, that's fine. But, in the postseason, he didn't really show up. And I think that's a problem because you had two guys in James Harden and Paul George that historically don't normally elevate their games in the playoffs. We see them do it sometimes occasionally, but they're just too inconsistent, and that's the problem. And I think, we kind of got baited because they had such a great regular season. And then, come playoff time, we kind of just forgot everything that this team has kind of been through in the past few years where, even a guy like Kawhi, it's not that his play is inconsistent, it's more so his health. And lo and behold, look at what happened. He barely played this series, and when he did, he looked god-awful. And it just really comes back to bite you, and I think that's the problem here. They aren't as deep as they were initially, before the Harden trade. And like you said, most of their pieces are in Philly at the moment. And that's tough because I think in the playoffs you really do need depth, and Dallas kind of showcased that, where you have a decent amount of role players for Dallas that are doing a lot. Like Green is doing a lot. Even like PJ Washington, Derek Lively, like having that center rotation of Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford is elite. I think that's goes kind of like in tandem because I think they do similar things. And then Derek Lively being so young, Gafford being undersized, like it's very versatile. And I think like you were talking about with their defense, it's for sure changed the way that Dallas really plays, because you looked at them more so like a offensive juggernaut, but now they're
Derek
kind of what's up.
Derek Jr. guarding Paul George.
Exactly. And that's a lot of length and athleticism that he has to deal with. And that really bothered him, as you could tell. Paul George shot 6 for 18 in an elimination game. So that kind of tells you all you really need to know. But, I think they're on the brink of being an elite two-way team. Some people might call them that right now. But, normally you would look at them and be like, yeah, that's a lot of offensive firepower. But now they have some really versatile guys. And I think that's kind of the key. And like, I don't want to like fast forward too much, but I guess we should probably talk about their next matchup in Oklahoma City. That's going to be a really interesting one, because I think it's going to come down to a lot of star power. Because you got guys like Doncic, Kyrie. It's going to be tough because I think Oklahoma City, this is going to be their biggest test, but at the same time, as good as Dallas's defenders are, I don't think I don't think Derrick Jones Jr. is like Herb Jones, right?
I got, yeah, I
Like
get what you're saying.
great defender, but at the end of the day, I think Shea is probably going to have an easier time against a guy like Derrick Jones Jr. versus a guy like Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, people like that. So I think that's going to be tough. And I'm really excited for this matchup, but it could really go either way. But going back to Dallas and the Clippers, like I think it's tough for the Clippers because I don't know where you go from here. That's the question, because you kind of mortgaged a lot of your future away to get Paul George, and it's kind of still like around, which is the problem. Because I mean, if you really think about it, like what? You only got Paul George, but you gave up Shea. Okay, we don't really care about Gallinari. The first rounder from Miami, 2020. Like, you're giving all these picks away. That's a lot of picks. It's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 picks.
One of those, I think, turned into Jalen Williams for Oklahoma City. I can't remember.
Yeah, it was the Clippers 2022.
Yeah,
unprotected.
Okay, yeah, exactly. So one of those turned into Jalen Williams, which is not great, right? Because he's obviously very good.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously SGA, right, is awesome as well. But I think it, like you said, the context matters, and it's tough because if you don't do the trade for Paul George, maybe you probably don't get Kawhi, and it's kind of hard to say no, right, to grabbing a superstar, right? It's kind of like what we said with Brooklyn. When it's like, okay, you can get Kevin Durant, but you're also going to have to bring in Kyrie Irving, right? And it's like maybe you don't want to get into, maybe from their perspective, maybe they didn't want to get into the Kyrie Irving business, but it's kind of hard to say no, because if you do, then Kevin Durant maybe goes elsewhere, and you don't want to just say no to Kevin Durant when you have the opportunity to sign him and he wants to play for you.
Right.
So that's kind of how you have to look at it there. But then it's like their stars haven't really lived up to the billing, right? Like they've been good when they played, but like you said, they just haven't played a whole lot. Like they have not. They've had, obviously the first year they were, I guess, healthy enough in the bubble. I know Paul George missed a chunk of the first season together, and then they're in the bubble, right? And then they blow the 3-1 lead, right? When it looked like that they were, kind of on the verge of having, the rivalry with LA that they were looking, right? Then the following year, um, you know, they go to the conference finals, right? But Kawhi gets hurt in the second round. So then, obviously Paul George kind of, I guess redeems himself, but can't quite pull it off because obviously there's no Kawhi, right? Like maybe they go to the finals instead of the Suns if he's there, right? But and then obviously because Kawhi has the ACL injury, then he doesn't play at all next year. Paul George misses time, and then they miss the playoffs because they lose in the play-in. And then obviously last year, right? They looked pretty solid, right? They go to the playoffs. I think they were the fifth seed, and then they lose to the Suns in the first round because guess what? Paul George is hurt, and then Kawhi gets hurt.
Yeah.
Then obviously this year, this is the most games that those guys have probably played together since the first year. and then the same thing happens, right? It's the same script. So that's kind of the difficulty where it's just like I don't know how many more times you can really do this. But also, if you're the Clippers, like because of all the things that you gave up, you may not have a choice but to kind of ultimately, run it back, right? Because I mean, I guess you could say like, all right, maybe because again, they just gave Kawhi an extension, so I don't necessarily know. Like maybe if he was had like 1 year left on his deal, maybe you could be like, all right, we'll just trade him. He's somebody else's problem
You're
now.
right.
But like gave him an extension and like that health is probably not gonna improve. So maybe another team takes it on, but I don't know. Then it's like they're probably gonna have to re-sign Harden because you can't just let him walk. Um, and I don't think that they're gonna let Paul George walk either. Maybe he goes elsewhere. I know people like Mark Stein have suggested, oh, he could go to Philly, right? Maybe he goes to Orlando or something like that. But I just don't know. It's just that's kind of the issue with the Clippers that like it feels like they shouldn't run it back, but they're almost kind of forced themselves into a corner now where they may have to, right? Because it's like then you have the new arena. I mean, I guess like there's a theory where it's like you don't want to go into the new arena with a bad team, but then it's like, are the fans going to be super excited about a team that they just saw, have go out again early because of injuries? Like I don't know. So
Right.
like if it was me, I would probably just kind of cut my losses and probably just break it up. But again, that's a lot easier said than done, because you have to factor in all the other stuff, right? Because
Yeah.
and also it's like you have to re-sign George and Harden. You can't just be like, oh, we can sign him now and then trade him like 5 months later. Like it doesn't work like that.
Right.
Or and then if you let him walk, you don't get anything. So I don't know. It's just kind of brutal. I'm assuming they're gonna re-sign and bring back, or I guess I'm assuming they're gonna give Ty Lue an extension. I'm
It's what
sure
the
he,
rumors have
yeah,
suggested.
and it's like he's not had an ideal situation because his stars have been in and out, and sometimes like it's for random reasons. Where like because I think there were a couple of times right where like even like last season, like Kawhi would just leave a game and nobody knew why, and then it was just like, oh, that's just how he is, and it's like okay,
Yeah. There's always like a shroud of mystery about his health, and I think it's odd. It's an odd way of maneuvering, but I guess he's kind of earned that privilege because he is one of the top players in the league. But at the same time, it's like, geez, man.
yeah, I think that's the issue of what have you done for me lately, and I just with the Clipper stars, I just don't think I've done enough for them as of late. I mean, to be fair, they did take the season seriously for a while, right? Because
Hmm.
again, they were healthy, they played every night, and then it just fell apart again. So I think this has got to be the last year where we take them seriously. Like maybe they still have another really strong season again. Maybe they surprise us and go further
Right.
in the playoffs than we expect, but I'm not taking it seriously again. You know what I mean?
Sure, and it's funny because I think this was probably their best opportunity since like what 2021,
Yeah,
because you have the third star. I
yeah,
know some people probably wouldn't classify Harden as a star numbers wise, but I think impact on the game, I think he's for sure a star, not a superstar, but a star,
right.
because he's doing a lot, in terms of playmaking and shooting and being efficient, but when he doesn't show up, it's tough, and that's the problem. You put your faith in some guys that are very inconsistent in multiple fronts, whether it be health, whether it be playoff experience, whatever the case may be, performances, and then also just looking at the bench for the Clippers, I think you have a great candidate for six man of the year in Norman Powell, who's great off the bench. You have Russ, who can be good off the bench. He was just very bad in this series. I thought didn't really do too much. Kind of felt like let the Mavericks kind of get in his head, which is kind of ironic. Plumlee, I think, was a game changer at times, but then you look around and it's like other guys are a little bit too young or a little bit too one-dimensional to kind of play in the playoffs. Like Bones Highland would probably give you nothing on the defensive end, but maybe a little bit of something on the offensive end. And it's just maybe this team wasn't like constructed for playoffs, and that's kind of how it feels because I think we can wholeheartedly label them as a regular season team from now on.
And I think, you know, even with the Westbrook thing, and there's been, because this is what happens a lot of times when teams are eliminated and they perform below expectations, where you have the hit pieces come out,
Yep.
right? And there was stuff like, I think the Athletic mentioned, I think it was Sam Amick kind of mentioned stuff like, he wasn't super thrilled about the fact that I think he was in trade rumors right around the deadline, right? Some other stuff where I think, and Westbrook, said that it wasn't true, but there was some stuff about the fact that he wasn't really that thrilled about coming off the bench,
Hmm.
right? And that maybe, that could be a situation where maybe he goes elsewhere, to look for some bigger role. I don't necessarily know, but that I don't know. Like, and that's kind of the interesting thing where it's just like when these type of stories come out, it just kind of feels difficult for me to look at it and just be like just run it back. But at the
Right.
same time, it may be what they end up doing because I again, you don't really have many picks. Um, you've already given up a lot to pretty much put that roster together. So you're either kind of forced to make it work or or just cut your losses. And I think they'll probably just run it back again. But again, is there like I just how does this team get better? I guess
Hmm.
that's the question. Especially because again, you can't rely on your stars because they're never healthy. So if your main guys aren't available, then you have no chance, right? Like they had like the series was done once we knew Kawhi was probably not going to be healthy, right? And we saw him in those two games and he didn't look like himself. And he actually got worse in the second game, which was even more of a red flag. So I don't know if he plays in the Olympics. I know he's on the Olympic team, but it, I don't know. I think it would be kind of bizarre, right, for him to literally not play at all in the playoffs and then play in the Olympics. I mean, I don't. Maybe that's kind of like overanalyzing or overreaching, but I don't know. That just the way he looked seemed like something where it's like I'd be kind of surprised if he was just like okay all of a sudden by the Olympics, but I could be wrong because I don't know what it is because we never know with him for whatever reason.
Yeah, it's wild, and there's so many factors. But at the end of the day, I think there is a way for this team to get better. It's just not gonna happen. I think in the next couple of years, it's probably going to take a full-on rebuild and a committed front office to get that done. And I think you kind of at this point, I think you kind of have to just ride it out. You traded for Harden, you kind of went all in, win now. You did that, didn't really win anything. Kawhi, same story. Paul George, pretty much same story. So I think you're kind of stuck with the three guys, and you got to hope that they can win. But like you said, I think we can kind of put them in the fraud category, regular season team for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at this point, I mean, Paul George is going to be in year, what, like 14, 15, right?
Yeah,
So he's going to be like 34, 35. I mean, what is Kawhi? I guess he'd be, what, like year 13?
yeah,
He was the year after, right? And he's, what, 32,
mm-hmm.
right? Westbrook already like 35, right? Harden's going to be 35, and he was in the 2009 draft, right? So
Right.
he's, in year, he's going to be in year 15 or 16 or whatever. So it's just, I don't know. Like those guys, because they're older, like I don't think you're going to get as many consistent performances. But it's wild because they did look good, for a stretch during the regular season. But, there
And they
was
had
a
a
reason
couple of
why.
good games too in the postseason, but just
Right.
not consistent enough. They
Yeah.
combined for 34 points, shooting 11 for 34 from the field in an elimination game. That's
Yeah.
sorry as heck.
Right. I think once, the post All-Star break happened, I think we both kind of just shifted away from the team,
100%.
and I think that's kind of what
Yeah.
happened. Like yeah, it seemed like he was just like maybe they'll show up, but we just don't know. And I think I guess that stretch was just kind of that, just a stretch.
Yeah.
But now moving on, I guess we can look forward, I suppose, into that Dallas Oklahoma City
Sure.
series, right? Going to be an interesting series, right? Obviously,
Hmm.
OKC has home court. All right, they swept their first round series against New Orleans, but this is a different team, right? Obviously, the best player for the Mavs is not Brandon Ingram; it is Luka Doncic. With Kyrie Irving as the co-star, right? So like Kyrie Irving would be like in that Brandon Ingram, probably better than Brandon Ingram at this point tier. Well, not probably he is. He's still better than
Yeah.
Brandon Ingram, but
Yeah.
yeah, but you know what I mean. Like it's a different matchup. But I think, like you said, it kind of is going to be interesting into when you look at how both teams are going to be able to defend one another because obviously the way that OKC was able to defend New Orleans, right, with Ingram, you could put Lou Dort on him, and he could pretty much take him out of the game because Dort's a strong physical guy. What he doesn't have in terms of height, right? He's got in terms of strength. But that's not necessarily going to work against Luka. You can't really put a small guy against him, even if it is like a small physical player. Kind of have to put like a longer athletic player on him. And so I'm kind of curious, right? Like, I'm assuming they stick with the Lou Dort matchup on Luca, right? And then after that, Shea, is he gonna probably have to guard Kyrie because he I would say is a good defender,
Yeah.
right? And I don't necessarily know anybody else in the lineup that you would necessarily say like, all right, we're gonna put Kyrie on him. So it may have to be Shea. But and it's tough, right? Because that's not the same as the guys for New Orleans. You look at the Mavs bigs, right? Also different from Valanciunas, where they're not really post scorers, even though even though Gafford can be like a physical guy, right? You don't really dump the ball into him in the post like you do with Valanciunas, right? He kind of beats you, with I guess like a combination of strength and length, and then also like just kind of being able to jump a little bit, right? He's a lob threat, but at the same time, I don't know, right? Because Lively's also another energy big off the bench, but they don't hurt you as much offensively, but they can hurt you in other ways, right? With the lobs, right? So it can kind of when there's a broken play on offense, they can just kind of throw the ball up and those guys can catch it. Obviously, they can get offensive rebounds. So it's going to be interesting, right? Because OKC is obviously much smaller. Um, not much, but I think they're a little bit different from the Clippers, right? Because the Clippers can say we have Zubac, we have Mason Plumlee, right? OKC doesn't have quite as much size, but I think they have way more speed in comparison to the Clippers, and that could be something where they can match the Mavs' style of pace where they want to play up and down. And like you said, I think going back to when you mentioned, you don't necessarily know, even though the Mavs individual defenders can be solid, are they necessarily elite? Because the Mavs defense has been really good, but can you trust a guy like a Derek Jones Jr., like you said, to be able to guard Shea the way that you could guard, Paul George and Harden? Because Shea is, I think, a little bit more comfortable driving and attacking the basket. Obviously, he can get
100%.
to the free throw line literally whenever he wants. Um, and then even outside of that, you still have Jalen Williams, who you can play downhill or shoot. Who do you put on him, right? And then Chet Holmgren, right? There was nobody on the Clippers that was like that, where it's like a 7-footer that can play, inside and out, and then can also kind of deter you from going to the basket because the Clippers didn't really have. I guess Zubac kind of counts as a rim protector, right? But it's a lot different from Chet, where Chet's a lot more capable of switching and blocking shots. So both teams I think have pros and cons, and I'm kind of curious to see where it goes. Right, I know in the live stream I think we were both leaning, maybe zagging a little bit towards OKC.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you still feel that way. I'm
Yep,
assuming you do.
I do.
Yeah, and that's where it's going to be interesting because for the Mavs, I think you're going to have to continue to have your role players step up and hit big shots because they don't really have like a third, reliable offensive player. It's more so just like everybody else by committee, or I guess whoever the hot hand is, which will be kind of interesting because they can hurt you in a lot of ways. It's just I don't know because again, like the Mavs have way more playoff experience, obviously, because you have a guy in Kyrie who was on a championship team. He was on teams that went to the finals multiple times.
Yes,
Obviously,
sir.
also on teams that made deep playoff runs. Right, Luca, even though he's only been to the conference finals once, he's still been a lot of big playoff games. So that's an edge that I think you would assume you would give to Dallas. And I think they have the best player. But it's going to be interesting because Luca offensively, he was inconsistent in this series. I guess you could say he still played very well. He's the best player. Or you could say it was Kyrie, whichever one. But I think in order for them to beat OKC, I think you're going to need him to not shoot like 30% from the field and then like 20% from three. I think you're going to need a more efficient version of Luca unless you get like a crazy version from Kyrie, which could still happen. Because I'm curious to see how OKC defends him. But what OKC doesn't have like in terms of physical size, they do have a lot of athletes and length at different positions and skill, and that's the other thing, right? Where it's like they can have five guys on the floor that can dribble the ball, attack closeouts, hit pull up shots, right? They can have like five guys that can all do that at the same time, which you didn't have that with the Clippers. It was like two, maybe three guys
Yeah.
at the same time that could do that. And, a couple of them are different, right? Because Westbrook can put the ball on the floor and drive, but he can't really shoot. And even at this point, isn't quite as good of a finisher. So, whereas you don't have that issue with OKC, and I'm curious to see how the Mavs defensively respond to that because there's going to have to be a lot more, rotations. There's going to have to be probably, some other matchups that they're going to have to handle, which I don't think they had to worry about for the Clippers. But, I don't know. Like that's kind of the cool thing with this series. And then obviously if it gets to a game seven, it's in Oklahoma City. But you just kind of wonder, right? Because, OKC is obviously a very inexperienced playoff team. But they do have a lot of upper end talent as well. And that may be able to balance it out, but we'll see.
Yeah, and you talked about it, Lou Dort. He's going to be on Luca. He's going to be pretty much guarding him the entire game. I think the entire series. And that's going to be tough because I think Lou Dort is one of those guys where his ability to run through screens is actually impeccable. But the issue is, I think something that people don't really talk about is, well, you pretty much just said it. The Thunder are a much more quality team than the Pelicans. Or excuse me, the Thunder are a much more quality team than the Clippers. I think in terms of pick and roll. I think this is going to be really tough. And honestly, it goes for both sides. I think if you look at if you look at it from Dallas's perspective, right? I think those two guys, Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic, they benefit from the pick and roll to the maximum ability that they possibly can, and that's going to be tough because even if you look at when New Orleans was playing Oklahoma City, those screens were very poor. If you want me to be honest, I don't think they were as the best that you can get, which is why I think Lou Dort kind of was able to get into the grill of Brandon Ingram, and I don't think that's going to be the case here. I think you have some better quality bigs in terms of Lively. I think you have it better big, I think, than Valanciunas at this point. In Gafford as well, I think that two-headed monster is going to be very elite. They're faster. They can get to the rim. They're lob threats as well. And I think Chet's going to have his hands full as well, trying to play drop coverage depending on what they really want to do there. Because Chet, at the end of the day, he's a great defender. He has a lot of length, but at the same time, he does give up some of the easy ones, which is the odd thing about Chet. It's the weirdest thing. But at the end of the day, that's kind of what I'm going to be looking at is pick and roll punishment for both teams because I think they're so elite. And even with the Thunder, it could be like pick and pop, per se. And I think that's really tough. Another thing I'm looking at for this series is probably going to be the co-stars. I'm looking at Kyrie Irving, and I'm also looking at Jalen Williams. I think J-Dub, he's going to need to elevate if they want to beat the Mavericks because I'm going to assume that Luke is going to be playing his best basketball or close to it. I don't think he's going to have another poor series like you were talking about where he's shooting, piss poor. I think, he's probably going to be a little bit more consistent, and I think that elevates Dallas, but that also means J-Dub kind of has to ascend to a different tier as well because I just don't think if it's just Shea having like monster games without, Jalen Williams having some very good games as well, I don't think they could win. But I'm expecting J-Dub to kind of play like that. And like you said, Kyrie has the edge in experience, production, all that stuff. But at the end of the day, J-Dub has been playing very well through the postseason so far, especially through the 4 games against New Orleans. It's crazy. And then my final thing about this series is going to be mismatch hunting. That's going to be probably like the name of the game, I think, in terms of it, because,
Yeah.
They're going to target Luka. We know that. That's just going to be how they're going to play. Granted, Luka's been playing some pretty good defense, as he knows that he's kind of being targeted, which is kind of interesting. He's like, don't send help, which is potentially could ascend the Mavericks as well. But, I think foul trouble is also going to be another thing as well. But, the Thunder, they can switch everything defensively. Very capable defenders everywhere, all over the place. But, it's going to be tough. I think this is going to be a wild series. And then the other guy that I wanted to talk about was Josh Giddey. I think he's going to be a huge X factor because if he gets the Ben Simmons treatment, then I think this series is pretty much over. And especially if he doesn't capitalize on it, he's going to be a non-factor. I mean, you can obviously rotate other guys in there, but at the end of the day, I think you need him to kind of be out there to rebound, to do the little things, to even just hit the wide open shots. If he's open, he has to hit it. If he's not hitting it, I don't really see, Oklahoma City really going past like maybe 5 games if Josh Giddey really is not hitting anything.
Yeah, and then obviously, like you said, if he doesn't give you much, then you're gonna have to kind of turn to guys like Cason Wallace, maybe like an Isaiah Joe, right? Who I guess in theory are probably better fits in that group than Josh Giddey. But if he's gonna start and play, like he kind of has to do something. Like you said, he can't necessarily just be a zero, and that is kind of an X factor that we talked about for OKC going into the playoffs because they do have other players, at that position outside of him. It's just because he's the token starter. You kind of need something out of that guy, and again, that help if he plays well, that can help them because that's another ball handler. And if he can actually, do stuff like get to the basket and, hit his floaters, or like you said, just grab extra rebounds or, be another playmaker, that can help, their offense in ways where it's like if the offense is kind of just sputtering, it's nice to have like an additional player who can do stuff like that. Um, because they just haven't really gotten much from Hayward. And obviously they have other forwards, right? Because like Aaron Wiggins could just come in or Kendrick
Right.
Williams. They have other guys. It's just, how much are those guys going to be able to give you on a consistent basis is really going to kind of determine how far OKC goes. Because I think we kind of assume that OKC stars will be pretty good, because I think, obviously it's a different team from New Orleans. Dallas, has more talent, but I think we've kind of assumed like it seems like SGA, Jalen Williams, and Chet are pretty comfortable in this playoff environment. But the other guys, right? What do they give you at this point, right? And obviously Lou Dort's been in playoff games, so I'm not even really talking about him. But
Hmm.
just in general, what do the other guys look like? And that's like you said, that's going to shift the series, in a way because for OKC they're going to have to be able to defend because points obviously in the playoffs there are some games where points can just be hard to come by and
Yeah.
both teams are playing at a high level with high effort defensively, right, which is something we see that's different from the regular season, right, because a lot of times not all the time, right, but many times a lot of the defensive stuff can be fixed if guys are rotating faster or just playing with more effort. Obviously there's other stuff like schemes and um other physical limitations and skill sets that come into play, but like there's gonna be stretches where, yeah, like you're gonna have to find ways to get stops. And you're gonna have to like put together some lineups that can do both, right? So that's something that we're gonna have to factor in. But as of right now, we're leaning towards OKC, which I feel like is a zag.
Yeah.
But
OKC in
you know,
7 for me.
yeah, I think that they do have a chance to pull off the upset. It's just again because like with the Mavs, you give them credit for beating the Clippers, but that was still like a relatively competitive series without Kawhi. I know a lot of the Mavs wins were, pretty one sided, but I don't know it. But the Clippers still had talent, so it's just
Yeah.
with OKC, the talent is a little bit different, and I think it may be a little tougher for the Mavs to slow down. Although in the one regular season matchup that they had, that was right after the deadline. Dallas crushed Oklahoma City. But that and funny enough, that was with a different lineup because I'm pretty sure Gafford and Washington were both six men at that point, right?
Yeah.
Like they didn't start. So, that's going to be something interesting. And then like Hardaway, does he come back and does he play as a spark plug or are they just like we're good? I don't know, but it's going to be, I think, a really fun series. I think.
Yeah.
Once you get to the second round, that's when obviously like usually the better teams are there because that's why sometimes in the first round you get some ugly series and occasionally you get some good ones, but
Yeah.
like the 1-8s usually are kind of ugly. Not always, right? But like this year, Boston, Miami, that was
Yeah.
pretty ugly.
Yeah. That
Um,
was for sure my least favorite series.
yeah, OKC, New Orleans, other than game one,
Yeah.
pretty one
No
sided.
Zion. It's just how it goes. But I'm looking at OKC and I'm like, they have a top 5 offense and a top 5 defense. That's the thing that kind of gives them the edge here, I think.
Been that way the whole year, as
Exactly.
opposed to a 2-3 month stretch. Even though we know the Mavs because of Luca, right? You have a chance to beat anybody because you have a top five player.
Right. And it's like, I'm thinking that, you look at Oklahoma City and their roster, I'm going to say that they're probably deeper at this point. I think I like the talent that's on there that's probably going to play in these games a lot more, I think, than Dallas because although Dallas has been great, I think I like Oklahoma City's consistency a little bit more because you can have a stinker game where Gafford's going to be in foul trouble, and that can potentially shift your offense. And then you have to bring in Lively, who's not bad at all. He's great. It's just a different kind of big.
Yeah,
And, I don't know how Lively's going to match up against Chet because I feel like Lively kind of struggles against perimeter guys, in terms of closing out and rotating. But,
yeah, and he's not and he's not quite as physical as Gafford. And
right,
the Max Kleba thing is interesting, right? Because that was a guy that we kind of pushed out of the Dallas rotation, and then he kind of came in as sort of the stretch option at different points. And now I guess unless they play super small, they're not really going to have that option. But we're not saying that Maxi Kleba is swinging a series, but it's just
right,
something to think about, right? Because they have a couple of injuries to guys that were parts of their rotation. But to be fair, I guess, and maybe that is a credit to maybe the Mavs depth that people don't think about, right? You have other guys like Josh Green that could step in because he was hurt towards the end of the regular season, as was Lively, but now they're back and they're playing key roles, whereas other guys have been pushed out, right? Like Dwight Powell used to be their starting center. He doesn't play anymore at all, which, which is right. That's the correct thing. So
Yes, sir. And it's gonna be tough because I think the complementary players are a huge factor as well. I think Doncic or Luka, Kyrie, I think they're both gonna get theirs. I think the stat lines we already know what they're gonna be. They're gonna be insane. I think, but I mean the other guys. What do the other guys' stat lines look like? Because I think Chet, like you said, it's a force at the rim. He's a great rim protector. So I think Gafford and Lively, they're going to have to actually, make their lobs and all that stuff. And I don't know. It's tough because I think, if you look at OKC, they have a bunch of guys that are going to be coming off the bench. Wallace, Wiggins, Isaiah Joe, and the other Jalen Williams, the forward. That's going to be interesting. I think compared to, if you look at Dallas, where you have some guys that could potentially have stinkers, like even a guy like PJ Washington. He closed out the series against the Clippers very well, but he could have a game where he doesn't shoot the ball well, and that could really hurt Dallas because I think then that kind of forces Dallas to kind of go back to their old roots, and then Luka plays the hero ball. Kyrie is like Robin, and I don't think that's the recipe for success. I think the best version of the Mavericks is when everybody's kind of going, and even like in the Clippers series, like you talked about, Luka was not playing his best basketball. He's getting other people involved for sure. He was getting the rebounds, almost averaging a triple double. It's just his efficiency was bad, but the other guys were there to kind of mask that, and it's like, okay, you can see why they won that series because they had more off the bench. But I think Oklahoma City might be a little bit more consistent, but it all just comes down to really, making shots and make or miss league. So
that's a good quote from Darvin Ham. So
mm-hmm.
moving on, I guess we should get into probably the Cavs Magic one before we get into the Nuggets one, since that'll
Sure.
be tied together. So we had another elimination series, the Cavs Magic, right? This was earlier today. Kind of wild, right? Because it was funny because I remember I picked Cleveland to win this series going in. And I was kind of concerned that after the way Cleveland lost game 6, right, where Allen's out, Mitchell is hobbled even though he scores 50, nobody else contributes. I'm like, oh man, it feels like the Cavs are going to lose this series. But my pick was vindicated, right? So the Cavs ended up winning in 7. We both thought this was going to be a 6-7 game series, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because both of these teams, I think, are pretty close in terms of their talent. 106-94. And it was wild, right? Because the final score, is a little bit different than how the game initially went, because Orlando was crushing Cleveland in the first half, right? In the first quarter, I mean, at one point they were getting booed. They were down by as much as I think 18 in the first half, right? Paolo was outscoring like the entire team at different points. He was just getting to the free throw line pretty much every time. I think he had 18 free throws in the game, and credit to him, he made almost all of them. But then and then you were just kind of thinking like, oh man, what's gonna happen now with the Cavs? Where it's like another early first round exit, right? They might split up the team, right? Garland was so bad. What do you do with him? And obviously, and like in the first half, early on, Mobley was really good defensively, but the offense is another story. But either way, but then in the second half, right, different things happened, right? Donovan Mitchell just went crazy. I think he was like 2 for 11 or whatever he was in the first quarter, or whatever it was, and and then after that, right in the second half, he turned out he had 39 points, 9 rebounds, 5 assists, got to the free throw line 17 times, made 15 of them. A lot of really tough finishes around the basket. And the Cavs defense turned up in the second half, right? Isaac Okoro just kind of came out of nowhere and was just guarding Paolo and kind of took him out and made him a lot more, turned his offense more into, instead of I'm getting to the free throw line whenever I want and getting to my spots whenever I want, now I have to actually do some other stuff and kind of force up some more difficult shots. And once they kind of were able to limit Paolo, it was pretty much done. Because a lot of the other Magic guys just didn't show up in the second half, right? Wendell Carter Jr. was okay. But then you had Jalen Suggs and Franz Wagner go a combined 3 for 28, which, that's pretty bad.
Yeah, it's really bad.
The one that I think was a little bit more concerning was Wagner, because like Suggs was 2 for 13, but he was still taking shots. It didn't really seem like he was afraid to shoot, but Wagner, it kind of looked like he was sort of scared to shoot at different points. He was 1 for 15, which I think is the worst shooting percentage ever in a game seven.
Wow.
And it sure felt like it. He shot 6.7% from the field. So that's not very good if you didn't
Yeah.
know. But it was bad, right? It kind of was reminiscent of some of the stuff going on all year where it's like he couldn't make a three for most of the year. He just forgot how to shoot. And that's something that we're going to have to monitor with him because if his 3-point shot doesn't come back and all of a sudden he's just more of a slasher and not really capable of a shooter, obviously that lowers his ceiling. And it kind of changes how you view Orlando in terms of who you can really put around them. Hopefully it's just a fluke of a season, not a fluke, but hopefully it's just like a setback of a season. And then he does whatever he has to do in the offseason and gets his shot back because he's still young, but
Right.
just kind of a rough way to go out, but also like at the same time, like you can't ignore you know, 3 for 28, like from two guys is like just brutal. But that's the other factor, right? Because then that's really where the Magic lost the game. In addition to the Cavs turning it up on the defensive end, Mobley was great defensively to kind of make up for his so and so offense at different points in the game. Um, Garland wasn't great for most of the game, but he did have a stretch where like it felt like the game was starting to kind of turn in a direction and he was able to kind of, put it away. Max Strus, right, came out and just all of a sudden hit some threes after he was awful shooting for most of the series. So, that was kind of, and then even like a Sam Merrill just came in for like 10 minutes and hit a couple of threes. Levert off the bench, right? This was easily his best game where he had 15 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, just kind of providing a scoring spark off the bench, right? So he was huge
Yeah.
in that role. So this was obviously a big win for Cleveland, right? Because now you got your first round playoff series. I don't necessarily know if it changes a whole lot in the future because, obviously we'll get into that next matchup. But, either way, good win for the Cavs. I think I still would say like a really good season for Orlando. Um, but it is disappointing that you go out like that. But that's kind of the concern that I had for Orlando going into the series was their offense just you knew wasn't great. And all the home teams won, right? And in a game seven on the road, you can't shoot 33% as a team. Like that's you just there's no way you're going to be able to win a game shooting that poorly unless you make the other team shoot just as poorly. And to the Cavs' credit, like their offense was kind of starting to roll in the second half in a way that I think you'd be surprised given how good Orlando was defensively. But well, obviously we'll get into it and we'll talk about what Orlando will have to do in the offseason. But yeah, pretty impressive win by Cleveland, even though again a 7-game series against a team with no playoff experience is still kind of I don't know. But either way, given the fact that some guys were out due to injury and some guys were playing were also hobbled, although guys for Orlando were hobbled as well, still good, if you're Cleveland.
Yeah, and it's like, for Orlando's perspective, I think it's intriguing because I think what you have potentially in part of your tandem of stars. Paolo was amazing this series. I know,
Yeah.
he had a horrible start in terms of, turning the ball over, efficiency and all that, but he definitely calmed down. He averaged around 23 points, or actually 25 points, excuse me. And then also 7 rebounds, 4 assists, 47 from the field, 38 from the three. So kind of taking a step in the right direction for sure, especially, not being in the playoffs last year. And for this being his first series, I would consider those elite numbers for a guy of his caliber at the moment. And then also, the problem is Franz, like you were talking about, his consistency from the 3-point line, consistency from shooting. And like you said, it doesn't look like he is very decisive when the ball is in his hands at times. And I think that's because they don't have a playmaker. Sometimes you question who the main playmaker is, because when you're running through Franz and Banchero, it's fine. But not for the whole game. I think there's subsections of the game where you can kind of feel like, okay, this is a groove, this is working. But then, once it's the whole game, I'm kind of getting tired of seeing pick and rolls between Paolo and Franz Wagner, and then one of them just doesn't give up the ball. It just seems very clunky. Not the two in terms of being a fit together in terms of stars, but I think it's just when both of them are playmaking, it's too clunky. Alongside having like 2 3-and-D guys, and then also another center that can kind of space the floor. I get it. I know what they're trying to do, but point Franz is probably not the best way to go about, you know, getting better as a team. I think, you know, you do need that one point guard that can really facilitate, and that's tough because, you know, you look at their guard room, no real facilitators. They're pretty much all scorers or defensive guys. You know, Anthony Black, he didn't even play, and he's more of a defensive guy. Cole Anthony, offense, Fultz, offense, obviously. Jalen Suggs, more of a two guard, anyways. Definitely 3-and-D. So, you know, just a lack of offensive identity. But I think, you know, you can figure that out in the offseason for sure. I think there's multiple ways. You know, they have plenty of cap. So there'll be a way to kind of address that. But then you look at it from Cleveland's perspective. And like you talked about, you know, I think the worry was that it took them 7 games to kind of get rid of Orlando. But at the same time, that kind of speaks volumes to how good and consistent Orlando's defense was throughout the entire series. It's just, you know, when you're so good on defense and so piss poor on offense, it's really hard to get over the hump. And that's exactly what happened here, you know. And Donovan Mitchell showed up like he should and normally would. You know, he's very good in, I think, you know, the playoffs. He normally elevates very well. It's just the guys around him you kind of start to have questions about. Darius Garland, I think you have questions about, although, you know, he's had some very severe issues this season, whether it be health, personal stuff, lost a lot of weight. I think it was like 10 to 15 pounds earlier in the season. Yep, because his jaw was wired shut, so he couldn't really eat, you know, solid fluids. So I get it, you know, adjusting is hard, and then Donovan Mitchell pretty much had his back. But, you know, it also kind of begs the question with Jared Allen out, does their offense feel a little more? Does it feel more clunky or less clunky? Because I think it looks a little bit more. It seems like they have a better identity where it's like, you know, Donovan Mitchell can get downhill, Garland can potentially get downhill, and then, you know, you have the shooters to space the floor. It's just the problem is Mobley not too good on offense. That's the problem that I think I have. But I think there's better spacing when no Jared Allen is present. So, you know, we can talk about that for a little bit.
I think it has more so to do. I think it's just having both bigs together, I think, is kind of the problem because they don't space the floor. Like Mobley's kind of forced into taking more jumpers when he's at the 4, but he's just not a good outside shooter. Because Allen averaged, I think, 17 and, you know, 14 or whatever it was.
Yeah, he was very good.
Right, and it's just I think that's the issue is that I think when it's just one of them, because earlier in the season, right, you know, there was a stretch where there was no Mobley and no Garland, and they were really, really good on the offensive end because it was just like Donovan Mitchell, Jared Allen, and then a bunch of, you know, like floor spacers and defenders or whatever, and that's kind of what was working. But, you know, then when you go to both of them, that's when it gets a little bit stinky on offense, and I think that's kind of the problem where, you know, if you're going against the Celtics, right, you know, that's where it's going to be an issue because then those guys are going to be forced to, you know, one of those guys is probably going to be forced into situations where they're going to have to either guard a big who can shoot or they're going to have to guard one of the wings, which is going to be really tough. And they're not, and, you know, Mobley, you know, like you said, I think the thing for him is he doesn't have the same interior presence on offense that Allen has, but I think he's a better defender, even though Allen is a good defender. So I think that's kind of the issue, you know, in terms of like, if you looked at them, and we'll talk about their offseason whenever they get eliminated, if they, you know, if they lose, you know, that's kind of the issue where it's just like they both are good on both ends of the floor. It's just the issue is that I don't think they can necessarily play together. Is, you know, unless Evan Mobley can develop a jump shot, but he still seems pretty raw on the offensive end, even though his defense is really good. I think if, you know, ideally, I think you probably would like to have one of them and just kind of hope that, like, you know, if you keep Mobley, then you can kind of hope that his offense grows. And it may just be a little bit limited with both of those guys out there. And that's the interesting part, right? Because again, Allen was good in the games he played because they won the first 2 games. And he was kind of in those first 2 games, I think Mobley was shooting threes as well. And then after that, the offense was gone and it was done. Like, and you know, and that was kind of the issue. But yeah. So going back to Orlando, I think from their offseason perspective, like you need some type of like scoring perimeter player that can also, you know, kind of facilitate in some way, shape, or form. Like people have mentioned, you know, guys like a Paul George. I don't know if he would want to go here. You know, people have mentioned like a Clay.
I wouldn't even want those. Like that's just getting more of kind of what you have, you know, in Jalen Suggs and Gary Harris, although not the same tier.
Right. Some people have mentioned Malik Monk as well, right? Like let's say they pay him because they have a lot more cap. I don't think Sacramento has cap space at all. So let's say they pay him, I don't know, like $20 million a year. You could come over there and then maybe you replace Markel Fultz or somebody like that and just bring him Malik Monk and he can kind of just be, a scorer. And maybe you could elevate him into this. I don't know. Maybe he's still a sixth man, or maybe you even elevate him into the starting five and just be like, all right, Jalen Suggs, you can be like a 3-and-D point guard. I don't know. I don't know what they do. Some people have mentioned even a guy like a D'Lo. I don't know, like because obviously he can shoot and score. I guess play make. I
I
don't think
like that.
identity necessarily fits with the other guys in terms of the identity, but in terms of like his skill set, that could be something that I think would be kind of interesting, um, as well. And again, we don't know because the thing with Orlando is they could easily just be like, we're gonna give somebody, whoever it is, like a 2 year, you know, 80, $70 million deal, like we saw with Van Vliet, right? Where it's not a long term deal, but it's a lot of money for each year. That's something that they could do. I just don't, it just kind of depends on like what they're thinking,
Yeah.
because I think there's arguments to make for any of those players. It's just a matter of, for Orlando, what can you do in a way that also doesn't really take away from Paolo? Because obviously he's got some pretty good ball handling, creations, playmaking skills as well. And I don't necessarily think you want him to be forced into a situation where it's like go sit in the corner and just wait. You know what I mean? Like I think
Yeah.
you'd prefer, like you'd want him to continue to be engaged and have him grow his offensive game. Because he's still developing. So how can you bring in a guy that can kind of come in, kind of like what Mike Conley does with Edwards, where it's like he doesn't really take away from what Edwards does, while also doing some other stuff as well on the peripherals, right? That really helps out. So something like that for Orlando is probably something they could use. I just don't know if that's what they're going to do, but I feel like that would be pretty helpful because I mean they clearly need an offensive upgrade, right? Like again, like the 3-point shooting, like they have some guys that can hit threes, just not consistently, right? Like, and if Franz Wagner just can't shoot anymore, then that's something else that you have to weigh. So hopefully he can get his three back. Then you bring in another guard that can shoot and score, and then you got something. Because I think if you can find like some decent, consistent source of offense to go with the defense, that's going to be a really good team. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like I think that's
100%.
something that can be really sustainable. It's just again, it starts with finding that. And I think some of those players could be pretty helpful. I don't know if that's what they're actually going to do, but they have the ability to do it because they have a ton of cap space. And I'm sure there's probably somebody that would be okay, with playing there, especially if they're going to get paid a lot of money, even if it's a 2-year deal.
Yeah. And it's like the market is kind of bad if you think about it. Like,
Right.
nobody really
Somebody,
cares about Orlando.
right.
But
You
at
have to
the end
give
of the
them some.
day, they're
Yeah.
they're a good team. Like you
Yeah.
have to give them respect. The problem that I have, when kind of theory crafting about who on earth, they're going to target in the offseason is a lot of the targets that they kind of need are probably going to be the doom and unraveling of their great top five defense. And I just
Yeah.
don't know how I feel about that because I want them to kind of keep that defensive identity and I don't want that to kind of fizzle away, especially if they potentially try and take a big swing at like a trade target or something like that, or even like you were talking about, having all that cap. You're gonna pay somebody. Somebody's going there. I just don't know who it's gonna be, especially considering that you need a guy who's amazing on offense, but at the same time you don't want to just nuke that entire defense because, like, I love the D'Lo thing. When you first said it, and then I thought about it for literally a minute and 30 seconds, and then I was like, yeah, it's not going to work. He's going to get bullied. It's just not going to work. But, like, I would love to see them potentially trade for, like, a guy like DeJounte Murray. That would be interesting.
Right.
But the problem is, what on earth are you going to give up? I think you would have to probably give up a decent chunk of your pieces that you probably would want to keep around because they make your defense so good. And I don't think they would want to do that. Maybe like Malcolm Brogdon. I think that's more of a feasible thing. Something like that. Somebody like
Yeah.
that. But you might want to even go younger than that. But I don't know. It's going to be a tough one. But at the end of the day, like you said, they're going to get somebody, whether it's an improvement or not. Somebody's getting paid to play in Orlando.
Yeah, because it's like what we saw with Houston, right? Where it's like
Yeah.
they had cap space and they had to spend it somehow, and so they gave money, to those guys, and it was fine, right? Like it's
Right.
and especially like with Van Fleet, it's like what a 2-3 year deal. It's not a bad, that's not a bad
No,
situation at
not at
all
all.
because it's like if it doesn't work, you can get out of it quickly. if it does work, that's pretty cool. And if you bring him back, you probably won't have to give him that type of deal, to keep him. So that's
Absolutely.
something to factor in. But yeah, like I don't know, with Dejounte Murray, that's another guy where I feel like probably a guy that needs the ball a lot. It's going to take the ball out of Paolo's hands.
100%.
But like you said, then also, how do you get him? You're going to have to give up stuff. So that's where I think the first step is free agency because but again, either way, you could also say, like, okay, we didn't really get great options in free agency. Maybe we trade for somebody and bring them in with cap space. But then, that means you're probably going to have to give up picks. How comfortable are they with doing that? Maybe they are cool with it. I don't know. So, like you said, that's kind of the issue with theory crafting, where there's a lot of different ways you could take it. Um, but there's going to be only one way that they end up, using it. And that way, I think, like you said, whether it's good or not, it's going to be something.
Listen, I'm going to say this. I think their best target that they should get, Tyus Jones. Call it a day, if you want me to be real. I know he's going to be a free agent, like you were talking about, Malik Monk, potentially. Monte Morris, that's another guy. I think those are probably their top threes, now that I'm really thinking about it, in terms of free agents at the guard position. Because they're probably going to let somebody go. I think,
Fultz is probably the one that might be, because I think he's a free agent. And maybe they bring him back, but it's just like they already have a bunch of guards. They just drafted two.
yeah,
And one of them is a point guard in Anthony Black. So, and you don't want to make it seem like that was just a waste of a pick.
sure.
So, that's a situation where he's probably like gonna need to play next year because he'll be in year 2.
Yeah, and it's like, you're looking at Markel Fultz and Gary Harris. Which one would you probably want to have considering this identity? I'm taking Gary Harris.
Right. So, and then, obviously that brings us into the other second round matchup, right? Because now
Oh,
the
boy.
first round is where we have all the second round matchups. And so the one Cleveland will be facing next is the Boston Celtics. So that's your consolation prize, for winning, for beating the Orlando Magic.
Yep.
So how do we feel about this one? I
Oh,
feel like
it's
this.
bad.
Yeah,
It's bad.
like, because I think if you're Boston, I feel like Cleveland is the team that you would prefer to play. Like, I think that was the team that they were. I mean, not that they're actually like cheerleading, but I think that's probably the team that they're rooting for to win that series.
Yeah.
Because then you also factor in, okay, Orlando's inexperience could also just be an issue against Boston, even though Orlando has a ton of size and athleticism. And then with Cleveland, maybe you get a game because Donovan Mitchell is just that good and he just has a crazy game where he has like a 40-point bomb,
Yeah.
through 3 quarters or something like that, and that's
Mhm.
enough to get to the top. Maybe Mobley has a crazy game, or Garland has a bounce back performance, or even like maybe Jared Allen, if he's healthy, comes back and has a strong performance. But I think it would be a really tough ask for Cleveland to beat Boston, even without Porzingis. I just feel like with Boston, there's so many options defensively that similar to Orlando, even though it's not the same in terms of the size, but like their guards and their wings are great defensively and also really tough to cover on offense, right? Like I could see a scenario where it's like, we don't have to put Derek White or Drew Holiday on Donovan Mitchell and Garland. We could even, if we really wanted to, put Jason Tatum or Jalen Brown on them.
Mhm.
It doesn't always have to be those guys, and they can switch obviously. 1 through 4, I guess, and then obviously they have the shooters off the bench, right? So offensively, it's going to be very different from what Cleveland faced in Orlando. I know the Cleveland fans said we want Boston, but the Miami fans said that as well, and we know how that turned out. Albeit Miami was much more banged up, but I don't know. I like I would be pretty surprised if Cleveland wins more than like a game, maybe 2, because I just think Boston like is just significantly better than Orlando. And I would just say it also, like, if Boston is the team that we believe they are, there's no way you're losing to this Cleveland Cavaliers team. Like, and I think that this is a legitimate championship contender, even though I think right now it's the only one. Um, and it's going to be a cakewalk for them. But I still respect them enough where it's like, no way they're losing to this Cleveland team unless there's some catastrophic injury that happens, to one of their stars or something
Yeah.
like that. That's
If Jason Tatum and Jalen Brown didn't exist, then I would say Cleveland in 5. But since they do, Boston in 5. I think that's kind of what we're looking at. I think we're looking more so at a gentleman's sweep. I think, Cleveland will probably get 1 at home just because they're decent at home. But it's funny, like Boston, throughout the entire regular season, they were better away than the freaking Cleveland Cavaliers were at home. So that kind of tells you all you really need to know about how, you know, how powerful Boston really can be. I think, fully healthy. The problem is, Porzingis is not going to be there. But at the end of the day, I don't think it matters because I think, who on earth is going to stop Jason Tatum? Who on earth is going to stop Jaylen Brown? Who on earth is going to stop even Derek White? This guy's emerged and turned into a freaking 22-point per game scorer, which is kind of insane. But, at the end of the day, I think their defense is also there as well. It's more cohesive. It works. It flows. You have a lot of consistency from a lot of their starters, if not all of them, and their bench is just better as well. You have some great players coming off the bench, and Peyton Pritchard, Sam Hauser. They're going to elevate their play, and that's kind of just what Boston does. It's just a matter of can they win the finals. That's my only question with Boston at this point. I don't care who you really put in front of them, like you said, unless there is a crazy injury or illness or something like that. They're going to the finals, and I think this is going to be a cakewalk because let's be real here. Like, if Darius Garland kind of plays the way that he played in this series, you're definitely not winning, Yeah. It's just going to be Donovan Mitchell, and I don't think that's enough. As great as Donovan Mitchell is, he can't be a one-man show. It's not going to work. That's just not how the playoffs work, and I think Boston is a super team, Cleveland's just a team.
The only way that a one-man show can work is if you're like, a top, one guy. You know what I mean? Like in terms of like being one of like the three, maybe five at the best, at the most best players, right? And he's not there, right? He's very good, but I don't think he's in that tier where it's like he can win you a playoff series 1-on-5 or something like that.
He's
like,
tried.
Yeah, man. Like and to be fair, there's not many people that can do that. That's why it's a team sport. It's team basketball. It's very difficult to win in the playoffs. With like a 1-on-5 type, mindset. Even though we've seen Jalen Brunson kind of do it to an extent, but maybe that's the outlier. I don't know.
And will it carry over to the next round? That's the other question with Brunson.
Right. So then after that, then we also got Minnesota, Denver. Right. That was game one. I believe we both said that Minnesota would take game one against the Nuggets.
Yes, we did.
And they did. 106-99. Kind of wild how this game turned out, right? In the first quarter, Minnesota, in the first opening minutes, I think, was crushing Denver. I think they were up 18-4. And you kind of saw, like, all the problems that Minnesota presents, where it's like, that we talked about, where it's like, hey, you don't have a guy that can really stay in front of Edwards. You don't have a guy that's strong enough to kind of, deter him from getting to his spots. He can shoot over a lot of guys. Denver, doesn't necessarily have like another rim protector guy that can, even though Jokic and Gordon are good defenders, right? He can kind of just go through them or finish around them. And, he was just lighting them up, right? In the opening moments, obviously he ended up having 43 in the game. But either way, those were the issues. Then the Nuggets, kind of quickly came back into the game, went on a big run, and then it was pretty back and forth for most of the game. And then, in the second half, right, Minnesota's other guy showed up, right? Towns had 20 points, 4 rebounds, a big third quarter, even though he had some really just mind-bogglingly insane fouls where it's like, even though I thought defensively he was fine on Jokic, there were some other really major mistakes where it's like foul and jump shooters. I think he picked up a foul in the first, like, second or two of the game, right? Like literally right after the opening tip, which I don't think I've ever seen before. I've seen like the inbounds like the jump ball turnovers where nobody captures the ball or they have to do it again because somebody does something funny. I've never seen a foul like literally a second into the game.
Right.
I've never seen it. But,
and what did Anthony Edwards say, going into the series? Don't effing foul. And what did he do in the first second of the game?
But then you look around, right? Mike Conley, also, and I think in the third quarter had a stretch, right, where it was like, he started hitting some shots and had some good playmaking moments as well. He had 10 assists. Gobert, right, had 13 rebounds, 3 blocks, I believe, as well, right? Didn't score as much, but that's not what he's brought in here to do, right? He's brought in here to play some defense. Jaden McDaniels, right, he had 8 rebounds. He had 0 points and was 0 for 7. But he was pretty crucial as another defensive guy. They had Edwards on Jamal Murray a lot. I don't really think they used McDaniels defensively as much on Murray as we might have expected. And that's kind of the cool part, with Edwards, where it's like, in addition to him being able to score, and now he's a better playmaker as well. He can defend at a really high level as well, and you could tell he was really bothering Jamal Murray. And it's a huge difference, right, to go from being guarded by, say, like an Austin Reeves, guarded Murray relatively fine, but it's just a different type of guy when it's Austin Reeves compared to Anthony Edwards, who can also go back and fight you on the other end, and offensively as well, right, where he can give you 40. And he can do it over the course of 48 minutes, right? And he kept attacking and attacking on both ends of the floor, right? And you saw with the Nuggets, right? Like Jamal Murray was not very good in this game. I know he finished with 17 in the second half, but again, minus 22, right?
He
Which
was
is not
quiet
great.
in the first half.
Yeah,
It was really
I
bad.
think he was scoreless in the first half. Jokic had 32 and 9 and 8, but he was 11 for 25, had 7 turnovers, right? So I don't necessarily think he was as great out there. I think Edwards was the best player in that game. Michael Porter Jr., 20.6 rebounds, 4 of 7 from 3. The Denver bench actually played, I think, better than you would have expected. Um, but Minnesota's depth also at different points came to play, right? Naz Reid off the bench had 16 points, 4 rebounds, and a lot of it was in the fourth, right? In a crucial stretch where Minnesota, it felt like they might start to lose the game, and then Minnesota pulled it out in crunch time. So that was huge, right? So, obviously with Edwards, his stardom keeps climbing, and obviously if they want to win this series, you had to take one of the first 2 games, and ideally you want it to be the first game, right, to set the tone. And Denver came out pretty sloppy, and we talked about it, right? We're like one of the reasons why we expected Minnesota to win game 1 was, the Nuggets coming out of the Lakers series, even though it was a 5-game series, that was still like a back and forth, pretty physical series, right? Where like guys were getting banged up, right? Like Murray hurt his calf. Um, KCP, had a leg issue, I think. And a lot of those games were really competitive down to the wire. Meanwhile, Minnesota on the other end, they swept the Suns, and only one of those games was relatively close, right? Whereas the other ones were blowouts, so they won pretty handedly. And they came in, right? With the size to deter the Nuggets, and you still have the guy that can pretty much score it well. And this is kind of the roadmap, to be able to try to beat the Nuggets. Obviously, Minnesota is going to have to do it 3 more times. I think we both pick the Nuggets to win the series. So how did this game, so what did you think of this game, and did it make you, kind of rattled in terms of our pick, or what do you think?
Okay. You want me to be real here? So, Anthony Edwards was insane in this game, like you talked about. Career game. Unstoppable. And I think that might be a huge problem for Denver.
Right.
Because what is the recipe for stopping him? I know we went kind of into this series with the mindset of what's going to be the play to stop Jokic, but we might have to kind of rotate and do a flip and be like, what's the play to stop Ant-Man? Because, I mean, if you really think about it, Denver doesn't have a whole lot of rim protection, and you could clearly see it. Anthony Edwards can get downhill when he wants, but also when he does draw the defense, and then you have Aaron Gordon and Jokic down there kind of clogging the paint, he's going to kick out. Although, there are a couple times where he turned the ball, or one time where he turned the ball. It only happened once. And it was off a kick out. But regardless, I'm going to assume it's probably going to be forcing him to pass a little bit more. But how on earth do you do that? Do you have the personnel to do that? I think you do at times, but they might be a little hobbled. Like KCP, I think you can clearly tell he's a little hurt. And Jamal Murray, for sure, I don't think he's himself right now. I know he didn't practice after the first round with the Lakers. So, and he didn't score in the first half, like you talked about. I think that raises a lot of concerns. And I'm for sure rattled with my pick. I learned, I think we learned our lesson coming off the Phoenix series, where it's like, you can't really count Anthony Edwards out at this point. And I know that might be a little bit of a jump, but at the end of the day, even looking around at Minnesota as a whole, you kind of liked everything that they did. Mike Conley
Yeah.
brought in the veteran presence. Towns did his job. He didn't settle for threes. He wasn't jacking threes, It's not like he put up 10. He only put up 4 and shot 50%. That's all you really need him to do. Granted, the personal fouls were egregious, but at the end of the day, he did his job. Gobert
Yes.
did his job as well. Naz Reid stepping up for when Towns was in foul trouble, torching the Nuggets as well off the bench. I mean, this is kind of the statement that you would want to make, if you're the Timberwolves. They have so much confidence. It's insane. There's a lot. And I think, Denver will respond. I am worried, though. Like, if they go down 0-2, Minnesota's got it. I don't care. But if they split it, then I'm still feeling confident in the Nuggets, and I think they will bounce back. But just all around, like, Denver didn't really come out with that firepower. Jokic was very limited, I think. He wasn't the Jokic that we all know. This is definitely not the best version of him. He settled a lot, took too many threes for me personally, way too many turnovers, and definitely was not a factor on defense. I'm not saying that he normally is, but you could clearly tell their target was to kind of just put him in situations where he can't really use his big body to kind of just stand there and make people feel a little weird. Like, Anthony Edwards kind of just drove by him. Even Naz Reid, like, a lot of guys were kind of getting past him. And I really liked Minnesota's defensive approach as well, kind of pressing up with Jaden McDaniels, and then boom, Anthony Edwards switches on to Jamal Murray. Now, what do you do from there? And, Jamal Murray didn't really show up until the second half. He tried, but at the end of the day, it just was too little too late.
Right.
And, that's the tough part. But at the end of the day, I think both these teams match up very well in terms of size, personnel, the fit, the system, the schemes. It's just going to come down to who's the best player. It's either got to be Jokic or Jamal Murray, or the Nuggets pretty much lose this series. Because if it's Anthony Edwards every single game, you're cooked.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what it comes down to. And him playing at that level pretty much elevates what Minnesota's offense can do because, a lot of the concerns about how clunky it looks, and there were stretches in the game, when the Nuggets went on their run where it looked kind of rough, right? Where it was a lot of turnovers. It's a lot of just, I don't know, mindless, play out there. But when he's giving you that type of production, it kind of sorts out a lot of the issues with Minnesota's offense, where it's like, oh, well, now some of that other stuff now makes a lot of sense. And like, to be honest, like the formula and the pathway for putting together a championship team around a superstar is like, put them around like, really good defenders, two-way guys, some type of size, right? Which is what we see in Denver, what we see with Minnesota.
And shooters.
And yeah, and shooters. And I think, to be honest, like I think whoever wins this series, like, I think personally might win the title because, like, let's say
100%.
if Minnesota comes out here and they just take out the Nuggets in like 6 or something like that, and Edwards is just clearly the best player, that's probably going to be the team that's going to come
It's
out and win the
done.
title.
Give him the
Yeah,
ring.
yeah. So I think because again, like there's going to be other teams that are going to have an issue with this type of stuff as well, where it's like what do you do against a guy like that when he's rolling? Because again, like a guy like that that's normally really athletic, in the past, it'd be like, oh, that's a guy that you can kind of just dare him to shoot from the outside, but he can hit
He
those
can
types of shots.
shoot.
Exactly, right? And that's kind of the cool thing about the modern NBA now, where it's like a lot of these guys now, you don't have as many issues with those type of players where, in the past, yeah, that would be an issue for that type of guy. But now you have a guy like that who can do it all, and he can do it on defense too. So that's kind of the cool part about having a cheat code like that in your back pocket. But if the Nuggets are the team that we think they are, in theory, they should respond and come out a lot stronger than because they just got whooped in early on in that game. I know they came back, but it was pretty rattling, like to see like them just get completely just shredded
We haven't
on
seen them in
both
the
ends.
postseason, like, in a long time.
Right.
That's the scary
Yeah.
part. That's why I was like,
Right.
whoa, what a tone setter.
Which is wild because when you watch the first halves of them against the Lakers, it was kind of like that, where it's like the Lakers would throw the opening punch, and then the Nuggets would kind of ease their way back into the game. But I don't think you can do that against this Minnesota team because, like, even though they don't necessarily have like two, top whatever players, like they have one, and that guy can do it for 48 minutes. And he can kind of elevate the other guys around him as well. Where, like, again, they also have more size. Like the Lakers didn't have the same type of size where it's like the fourth quarter and you don't have Rui out there and it's Torian Prince with D'Lo and Austin and LeBron and AD, and then Gordon can just get an offensive rebound or Jokic can get an offensive rebound. You're not doing that against this team. So, that's the other factor where, you know, and it's kind of wild with the Nuggets where you got decent performances out of the bench guys and you lost, right? Because that's usually where you would think the Nuggets would win.
Yeah.
But some of their starters played pretty poorly. Jamal Murray was one. Um, Gordon, I
He
think
was
one of the
horrible.
yeah, I think the issue for him was that in the non-Jokic minutes, that was bad, right? Where like he was which is what they normally do. He's the backup five, and it did not work. Like
No.
it was rough. because they were still getting shots around the basket, and they were also spacing them out to the three. And so I don't know what you do there. Like, do you put DeAndre Jordan out there? Like,
No, no,
maybe,
no, no,
but
no, 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 anything but that. Please, no.
no, I just meant like from the perspective of like those second units can't be crushed that badly.
I get you.
And so I almost just kind of want, but then it's like then you have multiple guys out there who can't really shoot because you kind of
Yeah.
have that issue off the bench where it's like Peyton Watson. I think he airballed. Was he the guy that airballed the three in the corner? I swear that was him. Yeah, that was him. Christian Brown hit a three, and I don't even think he's hit a three all playoffs.
Nope.
Reggie Jackson came off the bench. I swear he hit more than two shots, but yeah, he only hit two shots.
Yeah, it felt like a lot more.
Yeah, so I don't know, but I think, like you said, it really comes down to Murray. He has to be better because if he's gonna just do that, they're gonna lose because there's no one else really on this Nuggets team that can really elevate like that. Because again, Michael Porter Jr. at 20, but it didn't really matter, and that's almost kind of his ceiling is probably like 25 to 30. In terms of what he does, because you're not really running a lot of plays for him.
Right.
You need Jamal Murray, right? Because if Jamal Murray had I don't know 28 or something like that, and he wasn't scoreless in the first half, maybe that would have been enough. But that's the thing is you're gonna need but it's wild because against the Lakers he was pretty bad in the first halves, and then he would play better in the fourth. But that was really only like 2 games, so that's kind of something to look at because, like you said, if he continues to struggle, and then it's Jokic and Ant-Man, I mean, that's going to make it a lot easier for Edwards to be the best player on the floor because I think Jokic is also kind of helped by, Jamal Murray playing really well, which again is not on him. That's typically what happens, with a lot of players. But, again, you need Jokic to be one. And then I think Murray has to be, he's not going to be two because I feel like Edwards is just going to be the number two. But it can't be so bad where it's oh my goodness, it's not even remotely close at all.
Yeah.
That's kind of
you can't have Towns outplaying Jamal Murray. If that's the case, you are done. Give them the ring already at this point.
So what do you feel like is going to happen, I guess, in the next game? Are we expecting the Nuggets to bounce back and split? Or is it just I don't know. Because it's the Nuggets haven't been in this situation before.
Right.
Because I guess they were before they were what they were now, but last year, they started all of the series with the leads, right? They won in 5 in the first round, they won in 6 in the second round, but they won the first 2. They never trailed in a series at all. This is the first time that they've trailed, and I think that also speaks to the Western Conference being better,
100%.
as well. And the Timberwolves are also better than they were last year, as is Edwards. So now their backs are against the wall. So this is the first time since, I guess before they were a title team, right, that their backs were against the wall and they have to respond, in order to kind of pull it out, or else they're in trouble. So what do we think happens? Do we expect them to bounce back and win game 2, or is it going to be more of the same? Because I feel like there's ways for the Nuggets to play better. I'm just curious to see okay, if Minnesota just kind of continues to guard Murray and forces him into tough shots, and all of a sudden the tough shots that he'd been making the last couple of seasons and seasons before that just don't go in because of whatever, then yeah. But what do you think?
I think I'm gonna say Nuggets probably win the next one. They're gonna be at home. I'm expecting a bounce back game from Jamal Murray, 100%. Also Jokic as well. Like I said, you can look at the stats. You can say Jokic had an okay game, but in my opinion, not it, bro. A lot of these buckets were not real.
So it's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about where it's I'm not gonna say it's stat padding, but the actual stats were not as good during the competitive parts of the game.
The box score of Denver does not reflect how they played in this game, in my opinion, especially Jokic and Jamal Murray. Because you can't really look at Jamal Murray's numbers in the box score. I guess you could by quarter technically, but at the end of the day, the horrible first half was very, very bad. But in Jokic having 32 points and being minus 12. And not really even doing as much as he normally would on the rebounds. Normally, he's kind of a guy where he's a lock for a double-double. He just was not an impact. You could feel it was almost meaningless stats from him, if you know what I'm trying to say. Where it's they look good on paper, but if you break it down, it's this was a bad game from Jokic and the Nuggets in general. And I think, the whole starting five has to be better. I think the only guy who I'll probably give a pass for, Michael Porter Jr. He was hitting his shots. I think, him being the best shooter out there is for sure, going to help propel them to the wins. He just needs to continue to do that. But there were times where he kind of got bullied on defense as well. Everybody got bullied on defense for Denver. And that's kind of the tough part, because Anthony Edwards, he scores at all three levels. He's doing post turnarounds in the mid range. He's going downhill. He's getting past Jokic, and he's pulling up from three from anywhere he wants. So that's the tough part. And there might literally be no answer for him. And if that's the case, then you need to come out with some offensive firepower of your own. Respond with a great Jokic game, and respond with Jamal Murray having monster games. That's the only way you're going to actually beat Minnesota, because they're elite. Yeah. Simple as that.
Again, look at the, Lakers rebounding totals, right? So, in game 5, he had 20 rebounds. In game 4, 14. In game 3, 15. In game 2, 20 rebounds, right? Which, again, makes a lot of sense when you look at the Laker personnel. Not the case against the Minnesota personnel.
Right.
But yeah, I think it starts with Jokic and Murray, I think, are going to have to be better in game 2, right? I don't think either of those guys played their best games. And again, look at the efficiency, right? 57, 50, 69, and 56 from the field against, the Lakers in some of those games. And then in this game, he was barely above 40%, 2 of 9 from 3.
Yeah.
But again, that's also a testament to the Minnesota defense, where they kind of force them into these possessions where it's like, you're not getting to the basket. Even the shots he made, where it's like, okay, if he's within 5 feet, it's pretty much automatic. Even some of those still missed at times. And the ones that he made were tough ones, where it's like they gave him nothing easy for the most part, which again, that's how you're going to have to beat the Nuggets, is you're going to have to beat them with size, and you're going to have to beat them, with some type of, offensive firepower and execution, right? Because Denver doesn't normally lose close games like this. And this was, a close game, in the fourth quarter at one point. And then Minnesota pulled it out because, again, if Edwards is the best player on the floor like he was in the Sun series, it's done.
Yeah, and they did it. Minnesota did everything they're supposed to do. They played on the road. They dealt through the adversity of Towns being in foul trouble. Mike Conley, Naz Reid, they both stepped up huge in the second half and kind of eclipsed whatever Jamal Murray's fake stats were. And then Edwards was the best player on the floor. And it's like, their numbers in the second half were ridiculous, in terms of efficiency. I don't expect them to kind of shoot, 70+% in the second half again in another game, which is kind of why I'm thinking not that Edwards is going to cool off. I think he's going to be amazing in the next game. I just think Minnesota as a whole is probably going to cool off. I'm kind of expecting a bad Towns game. Wouldn't surprise me if the guy fouls out. I'm also kind of expecting, maybe Mike Conley to have a worse game as well. But I think Edwards will probably have another a 30-point game. I think he's kind of a lock for 30 at this point. But then also I'm expecting Denver to have a better game. So if Denver as a whole has a better game than Minnesota, they're going to win the series and probably the game. So that's just kind of how I feel.
You could also count McDaniels was 0 for 7, and so
Very
what
true.
if he had, because he had a
25
couple of games,
points.
He had a couple of strong offensive performances against the Suns. So maybe if some of the shots that he missed in game 1, if they go in game 2, that could balance it out. But like you said, I think we believe that the Nuggets will win game 2, and they kind of have to, because again, not that they couldn't win the series, but I think it would be a very tall task. If you lose both games at home, and then that means you have to win 2 games in Minnesota, to even it out. I think that would be a very tall task. Not that they couldn't do it, but I think you have to respond in game 2 and just kind of say enough is enough. Because a lot of these first halves, I just think they've played very poorly so far in the postseason. And I just think, I don't know if it's just that the other team has come out with the opening punch. I don't know if it's that they've come out flat. I don't know if it's just, whatever. But, that's going to have to change. I think in this game, you're going to have to respond with the opening statement, especially at home.
Yeah.
Because the fans were pretty much silent, in the fourth quarter once it looked pretty clear that the game was over. Which you don't see that happen too often in Denver. Because, they only lost 1 game in the playoffs in Denver last year. And that was to the Heat of all teams. But, they've already lost 1. And, they could have lost a couple, in the first round, if it wasn't for the game winners. So
Literally.
Yeah. So, but again, that's how the playoffs goes, right? So now again, also, coming up on Monday, right? You'll have Knicks Pacers, right? So obviously that's going to be a series. Right now, I think we both lean towards the Knicks. So game one, is in New York, obviously because they're the higher seed. So what are we expecting, right? What are we expecting going into this game? I guess we kind of need the Knicks ideally to win game one if we want them to win the series. But of course, Indiana could come in, and take game one. But what are we expecting in this game? Because again, there's a lot of stuff going on here. Obviously the Knicks are still they only have 7 guys, but their 7 guys, for the most part, have delivered through the first round. But this is a different team compared to Philly, who doesn't have like a Joel Embiid, but they do have a lot more collective firepower that the Sixers don't necessarily have.
Yeah.
Which is going to be a different look, right? Because Indiana, they play more up and down, a lot more balanced and spread out of an offensive attack, and you have like an elite passer playmaker, even though he still hasn't really been the same since
Yeah.
his injury.
Yeah, and it's like, that's kind of the thing. I'm really looking at New York under a microscope. I think they have a lot more potential than Indiana. We've already talked about this series a little bit, in which it's either going to be, Indiana's either going to blow a team out or get blown out, and that's kind of their MO at this point. But I'm really looking at a guy like Jalen Brunson, obviously. I think he's going to be on a roll, so I'm kind of expecting them to come out strong. I don't think there's anybody really on the Pacers that's going to have an answer for Jalen Brunson, at least, a consistent one. So I'm kind of expecting the Knicks to come out at home, win the game, obviously take the series as well, and even like to hinder guys like maybe Tyrese Halliburton and Siakam. I'm really looking at OG Anunoby because he's been a great Swiss Army knife. We saw him kind of battling with Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid at times to get some very key stops and defensive plays. So that's kind of how I'm looking at the series as well. And I'm thinking, Tom Thibodeau's, he's just going to play his starters, whereas Indiana's going to play a lot of their bench guys. And I think, the quality of the two, I think, are very different. Indiana's a good bench, but obviously, if Thibs is playing his guys, 45, 48 minutes, then I think, they clear 100%. So I think the Knicks will win game one in the series, obviously.
Yeah, I think, again, it's a different team compared to Philly, but I think, the Knicks, it's some pretty valuable playoff experience. We'll see. I would assume, they've had a little bit of rest, after playing 45 to 48 minutes every game. But again, it's going to be different because the Pacers are going to make you run. But again, I think whoever controls the pace is going to win the series, right? No pun intended. I don't
Literally.
think that's, a hot take. I don't think that's super groundbreaking analysis, right? If the Knicks force the Pacers into playing a more slow style of basketball, that's going to be an advantage for New York, right? Where they slow the game down. It's half court. It's Brunson getting to his spots and everybody else playing off of him. Versus if it's Indiana gets a stop, run and gun, or scores after makes, then yeah, Indiana has the edge. So I expect in game one at home in the Garden. Obviously, they got they got shafted in terms of not seeing their team close the series out at home.
Yeah.
But they're in the second round, so they have a chance to see their team win a home game in game one. So I think we're expecting that as well. So
Yeah.
again, I think it should be a good series.
Yeah, and another factor that I kind of just thought of is like OG Anunoby hasn't guarded Siakam in the NBA like ever. They've guarded each other in practice, but now they're on completely different teams. That might actually be a very interesting matchup for both guys because they might pull out some tricks that we've never really seen before. But overall, the personnel, I think they match up very well in terms of the contrast. And like you were talking about controlling the pace and making sure they play slow. But on the other end of things, if the Pacers just come out and start running the floor, that's where you get those games where the Pacers are scoring 120 points, but also giving up 110 or something like that.
Yeah, because I think that's something that you got to think about. Just from the perspective of again, like you know, OG Anunoby, you assume has the Siakam assignment, right? So, and that's a very different matchup from Joel Embiid, right? Siakam is not as big or as physical, But, obviously he's more mobile, right? He's got the ball in his hands, doing different stuff off the dribble that Embiid doesn't always do.
Right.
So it's a different type of matchup, right? I guess more of a downhill type matchup. But, again, you brought in on an Anunoby, for both ends of the floor, right? And especially the defensive end of the floor. Um, the bigs for the Knicks, right? What does it look like this time? Because obviously Miles Turner is more, like a stretch big, right? Obviously, like Embiid can shoot, but he doesn't mind, like playing inside the 3-point line, right? Like either for face ups, with the elbow, free throw jump shots, or he's okay with posting up as well. But Miles Turner, right, is more of like a, you know, pop out to the 3-point line. Obviously he can roll as well, and he's I think a, I don't know, I guess he is a little more athletic than Embiid. I guess a faster player.
Yeah.
So it's a different type of matchup. But presumably, if you're the Knicks bigs, you're not going to pick up, 3-4 fouls in a quarter the way that you would guarding Embiid because it's just a different type of, offensive player, right?
Yeah.
And like he's not as good as Embiid, but like just in general, it presents some other problems, right? Because Turner can shoot threes in volume, right? Because Embiid can shoot threes, but he doesn't shoot them at a super high clip, right? Like he's not taking like 6, 7 threes in a game. Whereas Turner, against the Bucks, he was doing that, against Brook Lopez and kind of making him pay because he wasn't comfortable with coming out onto the perimeter. So I think that's where ideally like you need Robinson, and Hartenstein to kind of do the thing that they've been doing as well, right? Where they're getting offensive rebounds, or in Hartenstein's case, the little floaters, or running some offense, at the top of the key, that he can do as a passer. I think that's
Right.
going to be key, as well. And again, like the Knicks only have two guys off the bench, Robinson and McBride. So those guys are going to have to present something as well. I'm curious if he plays one more guy, but usually with Tibbs, I feel like he has a rotation and pretty much sticks with it. And then it's just like we're just gonna boost these guys' minutes up and just not have them come off the floor.
Right.
So that's something because I think with the Pacers bench, it's gonna be better than the Knicks bench. But you know, the bench sometimes has these games where it doesn't give them as much, right? Because that's kind of how they lost the two games against the Bucks, right? Where like their bench just gave them basically nothing. Whereas the Knicks starters we know, are going to be pretty consistent. So we'll see,
Yeah.
because again, I think also like Halliburton, I don't feel like he didn't have to be the best player on the floor. In that series, like who was the best player on the floor in the Pacers Bucks series?
I mean, it kind of ranged between, I feel like,
Because the first couple of
Siakam.
games,
Yeah,
and
because
then
he was
after,
averaging a bunch of points, I think. He's
yeah,
averaging like 37 points or
yeah.
something.
Then you had Miles Turner had some games, and then
Right.
obviously Halliburton had some games as well, right? Like it wasn't like he was bad at all, right?
Yeah.
It just
There was a game where
kind of
TJ McConnell was the best freaking point guard out there, too, from
right.
both
So
teams, which is crazy.
right, because that's the thing that would concern me if you're the Knicks, where if the bench, plays really well and kind of gets the Pacers either back into a game or extends leads, that's going to be a problem. So I don't know, but I think I feel like this is going to be another like 6, 7 game series,
Yeah.
maybe. Of course, I could be wrong because I just feel like the Knicks are going to have a couple of games like they had against Philly where it looks like they're going to win, and then they just run out of gas, and then the other team pulls it out at the end.
Yep.
But I think for now I'm leaning towards the Knicks to take the series. Brunson's been crazy, and I don't really see a reason for why it wouldn't continue because I don't think the Pacers defensively have like the same personnel that the Sixers have, even though again, like you said, some of what the Sixers was doing defensively was not really that great. And like eventually like Brunson still went off anyway, so like it didn't really matter.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, well that's pretty much, it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts on, all these playoff games. Obviously the first round is concluded, so now we're in the second round, right? So you pretty much have, I guess, 8 teams left at this point vying for the title, right? It should be some pretty competitive second round matchups, right? We got, a matchup that feels like a finals matchup in the second round, obviously, with two, very big physical teams.
Hmm.
So a lot of really good matchups. But again, let us know. And again, as we've talked before, right, we'll do live streams at the beginning, and at the end, right, of these series, right, we're planning to do one, Monday, right, as well, right, also that will kind of make up for the games that we didn't get to talk about and
Yeah.
the games that start tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that as well. Don't forget to continue to like, comment, and subscribe. And hopefully we'll either see you in the live stream on Monday, or we'll see you in our next episode or live stream.